Does this man look familiar? That's Chris Gaines. Who the hell is Chris Gaines, you ask? Well, Chris Gaines is Garth Brooks. Yes, that Garth Brooks. Envisioned as a performance art persona with a musical and major motion picture tie-in, Chris Gaines was intended to be the Ziggy Stardust to Garth Brooks' David Bowie. Instead, the Chris Gaines project nearly killed Garth Brooks' career and gave the world one of the most memorable and bizarre moments in music history.
I didn't say that. Chris said that.
Now, if you weren't alive in the 90s, Garth Brooks was a cultural phenomenon and one of the first real crossover stars for country music. A one-time shoe salesman turned country music megastar, Garth Brooks would go on to sell more records than anyone in American history. To say that he was a star at his peak would be a massive understatement. He was effectively the male Taylor Swift. And because of the scale of his popularity, he had and still has his share of detractors and trolls. From country music purists who think that he single-handedly ruined country music, to others who joke that his nice guy personality is a cover for a calculating serial murderer, this intentionally middle-of-the-road, non-offensive person is surprisingly somewhat of a polarizing figure online in 2023. He's also still massive and selling out stadiums in spite of all of that. And my mother in particular loves Garth Brooks. So when I told her I was doing a video on Chris Gaines, her first reaction was, "Who's that?" Then when I explained to her this is Garth's late 90s performance art persona and sent her a picture, she paused and then said, "Please be nice to Garth." So out of love for my mother, I promise, I will be nice to Garth Brooks. But we do have to talk about this.
Therapy, Chris discovered that his sex addiction had its roots in his early relationship with his father.
And this.
If Chris hadn't have gotten treatment for his sex addiction, I don't know if he'd be here with us today.
And this.
He had babes at home, on the road, on the bus, on tour, off tour, in the studio, out of the studio.
Anyways, by the late 90s, Garth was getting bored with being the biggest crossover star in history, and he needed a new creative outlet. Not only was he tired of singing country music, but he wanted to pursue acting. And the Chris Gaines persona, in his mind at least, was the one stone that could kill these two birds for him. Chris Gaines would not just be his brooding soft rock identity, but Gaines in his mind would ultimately be the perfect vehicle for Garth to finally transition into film. Garth believed so much in this new identity's potential for crossover greatness that he allegedly turned down the leading role for Twister and a supporting role offer from Steven Spielberg for Saving Private Ryan at the time. You see, these Hollywood casting agents and A-list directors were playing checkers, while Garth Brooks was playing chess. Garth, after all, had a master plan. Allegedly.
It's going to be an extremely cool year for me. I mean, this is the year that I get my chance to play a character in a movie, actually a fictitious rock legend that has existed over the last 15 years by the name of Chris Gaines. This is his music, and in the same breath, it's my music.
Garth Brooks' master plan was not just to record at least 5 albums as the fictional character, but to eventually release a major motion picture titled The Lamb, starring Garth Brooks as Chris Gaines. The film's plot, apparently, would have been about a recently murdered rock star, Chris Gaines, and an obsessive fan's attempt to uncover the truth behind his killing. Gaines, also known as, Garth, would appear only in flashbacks, and the movie would use these flashes from Gaines' life to help solve his mysterious murder and tell his backstory. Now, what was Chris Gaines' backstory, you ask? Well, the actual Chris Gaines backstory is so insane and convoluted that I'm not even going to attempt to explain it. Instead, I'm going to let Garth try and explain it.
So, this guy's in a car wreck in 1992, right? And he hides out for 3 or 4 years because he's really not happy with his face. And he kind of looked like Prince,
As you can see, even Garth struggles to explain who and what the hell Chris Gaines is. And he allegedly created the character and came up with the backstory in the first place. Even with a full-length behind the music dedicated to the character, the lore is still very hard to process, let alone explain. There are just so many ridiculous and convoluted beats to the story that will likely forever struggle to properly describe the character. But I'll try. A high school dropout son of Olympic swimmers, Chris Gaines became an internationally renowned pop star after starting the band Crush with his best friend Tommy, a licensed pilot and teen pop music prodigy. Tommy, true to the famous rock and roll trope, dies in a plane crash, tragically leaving Chris Gaines to pursue a career as a solo artist. After a string of massively successful albums, Chris Gaines' father dies of cancer. The only thing that Chris could think to do to heal his incredible emotional pain was to have sex, and lots of it.
I've gone to his hotel room on occasion, and there have been more, women there than I would count on one hand. The term sex addiction didn't exist for me.
I do remember one time when he wanted my sister and me to go to bed with him together.
I just like women.
You see, Garth, or at least someone involved with this project, clearly wanted to reassure everyone that not only did this falsetto singing goth daddy Garth get laid, but he loved women. Women and sex with women were in fact his only addiction in life. In case anyone got any other ideas, of course. Chris Gaines' life ultimately got so crazy from all the sex he was having and records he was selling and managers he was fighting legally that he would get into a near fatal, physically disfiguring car accident.
My baby boy was broken. It was like a broken doll.
His jaw was literally almost ripped off.
His shoulder was ripped apart. His arms were broken. His pelvis was smashed up.
The accident and subsequent plastic surgery would transform Gaines from an internationally known sex symbol with the face of a model to an artist's rendering of Garth Brooks at a Matrix fan convention. If you're lost and confused by all of this, I don't blame you. I've been confused by this since 1999, and most everyone else was at the time as well. If you're asking yourself if this whole thing was a joke or meant as satire, you aren't alone with that either. When I was researching this video, I found some people online who swear that this character was an unrealized and abandoned attempt at satire by Garth Brooks. And for a second, I thought that this could be the case.
Oh yeah, laugh.
But from everything else that I could find, while elements of it were satirical of classic rock and roll tropes in the music business, this was by most reputable accounts a sincere effort, as was the ill-fated Chris Gaines movie and albums. Now, we should really talk about a big part of this project that we haven't gotten to yet, which is the album that did get released, Garth Brooks and the Life of Chris Gaines. Now, unlike Garth's other massively successful country albums, Garth didn't write or even co-write any of the songs for the album that was released in 1999. While you'd think that on what was promoted as Garth Brooks' Ziggy Stardust moment, that the hit songwriter would actually be heavily involved in the actual songwriting, that was allegedly not the case. Garth was apparently only responsible for the backstory and instead hired a team of songwriters, most famous for previously writing Change the World by Eric Clapton, to produce the music for this project. And if that's really the case, that explains a lot for me, because there's just a weird detachment that you experience when you listen to this album and picture the character that Garth is trying to play. As confused as the identity of Chris Gaines was in the VH1 special, the musical identity of Chris Gaines on this album is even more confusing. While it was marketed as a greatest hits album for a fictional artist, the songs still barely maintain a stylistic through line or a coherent concept enough to make it a successful concept album in that way. Ziggy Stardust, this was not. But that's not to say that all of the songs were necessarily bad songs. One of them I really like even, but just not when Garth sings it on this album. But even though I don't like this album personally, that is not meant to say that this album doesn't have its fans. It did sell 2 million albums after all when it was released and debuted at number 2 on the Billboard charts. It was only considered a disaster because Garth was used to selling 10 million records on a bad day in the 90s. 2 million records sold is still a lot of records, obviously, and Garth has a lot of diehard fans who will give whatever he does a chance. It's also his wife Trisha Yearwood's favorite album of his as well, so all is not lost for the man known as the liberal dad of country music. The admirable thing I will say is that while Garth initially let the criticisms and trolling about Chris Gaines get to him, he appears to have learned to take it on the chin. You could even say, with the recent news that he's considering releasing the other 5 Chris Gaines albums in the future, that Garth has embraced Chris Gaines as a character wholeheartedly once again. And on the off chance that Garth ever sees this or is watching this video, I think you could turn this Chris Gaines ship around. I don't usually have good advice, but if I had any, it would be to lean in. Release the albums, drop a new surprise music video in character, or hell, release a documentary about the Chris Gaines years. Just own it. We want to know what you were thinking. On that note, the lesson of the Chris Gaines saga is that there's no such thing as failure, at least if you're Garth Brooks. And while many said that this would be the death of Garth's career, after a decade-long pause, Garth is once again headlining stadiums as if it was still the 90s and is one of the biggest touring acts in the world. At the end of the day, love him or hate him, Garth Brooks has very few losses on his record. And even if Chris Gaines is one of them, at least he's not John Rich. That guy. And thank you for watching.